By any metric, you cannot say we have beautiful organizations. We really don't. We actually have really organizations that beg for innovation.
Beautiful is about people making mistakes, learning from them, and then getting to another level.
Anyone who understands modern technology, if they give you a 5-year plan, they are not going to be a successful CEO. You can say that with guarantee because you have no idea. TV, if you look, it took 75 years to get to 100 million users. Netflix takes 10 years and ChatGPT takes 2 months. As soon as you move your center of gravity towards more givers, you actually have so many upstream benefits.
It's human social systems we are talking about. It's humans that are in the center, that do the communication and then the action in organization, but we have forgotten that.
If I'm the head of a company and I'm just trying to extract from everyone for personal profit, it's going to be very logical next step to say, well, why would I hire Lothar when I can get an AI that's got like 10 times his IQ, when it doesn't get tired, it constantly works, and it produces content?
So why would you hire Lothar?
I would hire a human being because of the context.
What can you say after Buddha, right? Nothing can come.
Now, Lothar Wenzl.
Yes, thank you.
In this episode, we are talking to Nipun Mehta, US citizen born in India, who has studied computer science and philosophy, and who is the founder of Service Space, an incubator of projects that operates at the intersection of volunteerism, technology, and gift economy, which has now grown into a global ecosystem of over 1 million members and has delivered millions of dollars in service for free. He's been honored as unsung hero of compassion by the Dalai Lama, and was appointed by former US President Barack Obama to a council for addressing poverty and inequality in the United States. Before we talk about leadership in modern organizations and how artificial intelligence might shape our everyday work in the future, we will describe Nipun Mehta, like all our guests on the podcast, by his own personal sounds.
Could it be a tennis ball?
How do you know that?
Yeah, tennis was a big part of my life growing up. It taught me so many lessons, actually, about life, about effort, about surrender and flow. Actually, it taught me a lot about winning and losing as well. You play to win, usually, and then at some point you're like, oh, I didn't like losing, but every time I win, I'm actually giving that bad feeling to other people. And that was a profound sort of moment for me when I first had that thought. And I was like, well, can I arrange my life around more infinite games rather than these finite games where your winning comes at the cost of other people losing?
I now will play another sound, which is, I guess, the loudest we've ever played.
Sound of silence.
Yes. What's that got to do with you?
Oh, I think it's everything for me. I think so much of music comes from silence. Without the silence in between the notes, you wouldn't have music. And so how do you learn to embrace that? I think we have a society that's biased towards the notes, so to speak, the action. But how do you glue that action together into coherence through silence? So silence is a pretty big part of my life.
And if you're open to it, then silence can always sound different, no?
Silence is pretty loud. It's a pretty amazing party.
That's a nice one.
So we'll have a party today,
yeah.
But maybe not totally in silence. Die Schöne
Und das Biest.
Warum schöne Organisationen die Welt verändern. Ein Podcast von
Mari Lang
und Train Consulting Geschäftsführer Lothar Wenzl. Hello and welcome to this podcast episode, the first one in English because we have an international guest with us. Hi Nipun.
Hello.
It's so nice to have you here.
Happy to be here.
Maybe we'll start with the definition. You're always talking about giftivism and the gift economy. What do you mean by that?
I think a gift economy is a shift from transaction to relationship. And transaction has a very narrow sense of reciprocity. It's usually direct reciprocity. I give to you, what are you giving back to me? But I think if we expand it to indirect reciprocity, that my mom does something for me, I do something for my brother does something for my dad, and what goes around sort of comes around. It keeps on circulating. And I think that shift that we can bring from direct reciprocity to indirect reciprocity is facilitated by different cultures of gift. And how do we bring that into circulation? That's something I've been thinking a lot about. We've done a lot of different experiments, including Karma Kitchen here in Vienna.
Karma Kitchen is like a restaurant chain where people don't pay for their own food, but they actually are paid by the one who's come before, and they will pay for the next one, right?
Yeah. You go into a restaurant, you have a meal like you would on any other time, but your check reads zero. It's zero because someone before you has paid for you, someone you don't know. So you're forced to expand your sense of care for people before you, and then you get to pay forward whatever you want for people after you. So you're really expanding your sense of reciprocity from here's my money and this is owed to me to really thinking in a much broader way. And what happens when we do that individually, and what happens when we do that collectively?
And that's working? I mean, in a sense of, traditional economy, and when you think about capital?
Yeah, I mean, in Vienna, they just had it at a restaurant called Vollpension for 3 months right here this summer. So, yeah, I mean, a lot of people say, oh, can it work? Can you actually trust people to pay forward? Will they do that? Because this goes against the dominant paradigm narrative, which is that people are fundamentally selfish. They aim to maximize self-interest. And we said, yeah, if they do, then this is going to fail. It's okay, we tried. But what we discovered actually is quite the opposite, that people respond to generosity with greater generosity. But it's not going to work for every single thing. It's going to work where you can create strong context. So context matters. We are so driven by content alone. And if you're just doing content, if you just do a buffet line and say everyone pay whatever you want, it wouldn't work. But if you walk in and underneath your table is like a quote, on your table there's a notepad where you can write a note for people after you, and you can flip it back and read what someone before you on that table has done, it starts to expand your consciousness. So you take something which is transactional, which is a very narrow form of reciprocity, and you use that excuse to build a much bigger reciprocity.
You work with a lot of companies, Lothar. We were talking about restaurants now, so are there any fields of business where you can see this model working, like without questioning it?
My first answer is no. Because not directly. But what I see in our work with organizations and with people as such is that there is a big longing for that, for resonance, for contact even, for being together, for just being able to give.
Yeah.
Because I always in my life had the feeling I have more joy in giving than in receiving a present, for example. Yeah. Because it brings so much back to me. I get so much for giving anyway. And this is for sure the concept, also one of the concepts behind. But as you said, context matters. If the context is a capitalist, very competition-driven context, that's very different, and the belief systems are in contrast to that of capitalism, of the classic form, neoliberal or whatever capitalism. That is against it. But I think that people are wired for it anyway, because this is our foundation, because we come from nature, we go to nature, so we have a big longing for that. And that's what we see in organizations as well. That's why we also strive so much for what does your company give to the world, not take from the world, because the exploitation of resources is widespread, we know that.
And you can narrow that down into finer and finer delta. Like you can look at your employees and not say, how am I extracting the maximum amount from them for my purposes, but actually start to, and I think really even start to expand your sense of wealth from just financial capital to other forms of capital. So all too often, even with generosity, we are all wired to care. There's tons of evidence around that. But all too often, we make generosity into a luxury sport. So we say, well, first you need to have to give. And I think what that undermines is that there are so many different forms of wealth. And usually when we relate to each other, we sometimes evoke our self-centeredness, even in giving. And so we say, I have and you don't have, which actually is a secret way of feeling more power. And that's the sympathy model. That's how we do aid in the world. That's how we say, oh, you should give. Well, who should I give to? Oh, that poor person. But what we don't realize is that, well, that person has a certain kind of poverty and they need a certain kind of wealth. But I have a certain kind of wealth, but I also have a certain kind of poverty. And if you're able to engage with people in that way, then it's no longer a transaction from my wealth to your poverty. It's actually a relationship between all my expressions of wealth and all my expressions of poverty coming together with all your expressions of wealth and expressions of poverty. And when you bring that together, the kind of coherence you get and the kind of productivity it actually leads to is remarkable. So it's a very different frame to look at it. And Adam Grant at Wharton has done a lot of work around givers, takers, and matchers. And as soon as you move your center of gravity towards more givers, you actually have so many upstream benefits.
Also, when we talk about capital, we most of the time talk about financial capital.
Yeah.
And that's what companies are always ranked, like how much money they make and earn. And you, Nipun, you say there is more capital than just a financial one.
Yeah, definitely. I mean,
so companies, on which capital should they maybe focus on to be a beautiful organization, as Lothar is saying?
Well, for instance, there's time capital. Like, people want to volunteer. So there's a lot of your employee retention is much better. Your attrition is much lower if you support your employees in volunteering in places where they are called to volunteer. So there's a lot of research around that, right? And so you say, well, okay, that's time capital. How do I amplify that? How do I circulate that? How do I allow that to build on itself? You can look at even things like attention capital. We were talking
Can I just quickly interrupt here with the time capital, because now I hear a critical voice saying within a company, I have so much work anyway, and now I should do volunteer work as well. I have my family, I have so much to do. I'm like, so that sounds to me almost like
more stress.
Yeah. So how would you react to someone criticizing that and saying, well, how should we do that? We don't have any time anyway.
I think all too often that's usually an untested hypothesis. So there's some very interesting research. Again, Adam Grant references this. He says that we tend to think that, oh my God, I have so many things. And so to return back to my center, I actually need to stop those things and go to a spa or take a vacation. But there is interesting evidence that shows that actually changing the nature of your work, right? Doing things that actually makes you come alive ends up being regenerative for you. And so it's not just, less is not always more. Because they did this research with teachers who were burnt out. And when you're burnt out, you say, well, okay, one more program for you to avoid burnout. And that just feels overwhelming. But with this control group, they actually gave them more things to do, but that were more aligned with their values and what made them come alive. And so they added things that actually reduced the stress over there. So I don't think it's quite a simple linear equation, the way we tend to simplistically talk about some of this.
I would agree with because we know also from research that stress does not come from doing more work in the same time. It comes from doing work that either you don't like, work that doesn't make any sense to you, or whatever. That's what increases stress. The other thing I would like to comment on is even I think we need to find different language on notions like capital. We cannot use these words anymore because they are taken by the capitalistic system. So we need to find other expressions so to change our world and therefore change then our actions, I think, whatever that means, because time is never an excuse. It's always a priority.
Yeah.
What do I want to spend my next 2 hours on is always a decision we can make. I know it's very hard.
Yeah.
And in this way of living, most of us are in, including myself, it's hard to make these decisions.
Well, and similarly, you can apply the same sort of skepticism to attention capital or attention wealth or attention period, if you don't want to use those words. Because I remember one of my friends runs a very leveraged private equity firm on Wall Street, and one of his staff comes in and says, we should do a minute of silence before our meetings. And he's like, no, why would we waste our time? We bill every 3 minutes, right? So even a minute feels like it's stress. But as soon as they did that, they were like, oh, that actually regenerated the other 2 minutes that we were billing, or the other, rest of the day. Not only regenerated that, I changed the dynamic between me and others, because I was interrupting other people less. And then, that had all these upstream benefits of collaboration and productivity and all of that. And so I think we have to use this kind of counterintuitive logic to see that, is it really, just test the hypothesis, is it really going to take more, or is it going to add more? And really, your baseline is pretty low in traditional organizations. Dissatisfaction, the sort of quiet quitting mindset is so high. And so you're like, okay, well, clearly your ideas, your current status quo is not working out for you. I mean, there is, by any metric, you cannot say we have beautiful organizations. We really don't. We actually have really organizations that beg for innovation. And we haven't really innovated organizations for a long time. And so it's like, well, if we are going to innovate, what will be that radical new way to go about it? And Frederick Laloux has done some very interesting work around organizing. He says we organized initially as wolf packs, which was very reactive. Then we went from that to organizing in command and control sort of settings, which is armies and churches, that kind of thing. Then you had modern day corporations that were more machine-like. So your boss says, either you do this job, if you don't do it, I fire you, I find somebody else to do it.
And to comment on that, we have, even it's not to go back to something we already had, it's we have never seen different forms of organization. We have never seen what we are now talking about, new work or beautiful organization, however you call it.
Yeah.
We have never experienced that yet. It's not easy because we have no concepts, no mind concepts, no consciousness for that, because we have never seen it.
Well, and so Laloux actually says you go from corporations to purpose-driven organizations to living systems approach. And when you say living systems approach, it's sort of like what we were talking about earlier, that if all your wealth and poverty comes together with all my wealth and poverty, that's a high bandwidth connection. And who do you have to be to hold high bandwidth connections? It's much easier to say, well, I just want you as a radio host, and I just want you as a note taker, and I just want you as this. I don't want to hold all of you for in all ways. But if you can actually be that kind of a person, you will get so much more, possibility in your institutions in any effort that you do.
And we are currently talking about, because social system is also a term we use in systemic thinking, but we try to go beyond that, because it's human social systems we are talking about. It's humans that are in the center, that do the communication and then the action in organization. But we have forgotten that, because Taylorism and with for good reasons at that time tried to pull the persons, the individuals, out of the process because they're error prone. That's why we need to go at least back to a concept where the humans are in the center, because they run the organization.
Especially with AI around the corner.
I just wanted to say,
topic,
isn't
right?
the whole development going in the other direction, that we don't see the human in the center, but we see the new technologies in the center? And that's also a topic you deal with a lot. You think a lot about how artificial intelligence will affect us as humans, and also our society, and also companies, of course.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, if my algorithm is an extractive algorithm, if I'm the head of a company and I'm just trying to extract from everyone for personal profit, it's going to be very logical next step to say, well, why would I hire Lothar when I can get an AI that's got like 10 times his IQ, when it doesn't get tired, it constantly works, and it produces content?
So why would you hire Lothar?
I would hire a human being. I would hire Lothar because of the context. Because you are not just your content. And if we have just reduced people into content, that game is going to be over, because the price of knowledge is going to zero. But are we much more than that? Or what is something unique that human beings can offer? What is the way in which we come together as two beings? And what happens in that field of emergence, where it's not just 1 + 1 is 2, it's much more than 2. And if we can hold that possibility, then it's like, yeah, I want humans at the center of the organization. But if you've just been running at this thing that my purpose of coming together here is to get a radio show, like, why even have me in the studio? And what difference does that make? so that the person listening, how does who I am affect how I relate to you in real life, and how does that affect the person listening to the content on the radio? There is a through line, but if we don't see that through line, if I'm the boss of this radio station and I'm saying, well, the net output is that you have a show and I monetize attention of people, and that's my bottom line, in that case, you would not want to waste your time doing this whole thing. In fact, you would say, well, we could do a Zoom call. At some point, you don't even need a Zoom call. You just talk to my bot, and it'll give you answers. And there are many podcasts with AI. I was very moved, I don't know if that's the right word, but, Joe Rogan, the most popular podcaster in the world, interviewed Steve Jobs. And Steve Jobs passed away.
I heard it, yeah.
And you were like, wow. And Eric Schmidt of Google says, I was moved to tears because I knew Steve for 35 years, and this is exactly how he would respond. Mm-hmm. So is it just content? So when you talk about beautiful organizations, underneath it, you're asking the question of, well, what exactly is beauty when two hearts come together? And if you can't ask that question, if you're just rooted in productivity, then I think that's a whole different trajectory. So we actually need leaders to step into this possibility. We think of it as social permaculture, leading with the context of a field and not just the fruits.
And first of all, I'm glad he says that he would hire human beings because you're very much into AI, I know. But then bring it down to the concept of beautiful organization for me very clearly, because only human beings can be in resonance with each other. In resonance meaning it's not just question and answer, it's a dialogue with an open end, where you don't know where it will lead to, what emotions are underneath, and what emotions drive us to be creative, for example, together, because it's not 1 + 1 having a dialogue. It's 1 + 1 are in a dialogue in creating an own communication system that leads to something else, something much higher. And this is 1 + 1 would then be 11, as my friend Stelio says.
Yeah. As we have a lot of critics out there, I have to fulfill this role.
Yes, thank you.
We can't just, beautiful.
It's a good life.
Exactly. So I will say one thing that humans also do is make mistakes. And machines, more or less, you can somehow try to erase the mistakes and make it more efficient and so on. So how would you deal with this? Because I was thinking about it. Lothar said, we don't know the outcome of this interview. We don't know where it's going to lead. So this, for a company, can also be like a threat. We don't know where it's going. And we want it to be, successful, and we want to monetize, and we want to get out in the market. And if we don't know where we're going, how do we deal with that?
Well,
with mistakes and, this...
And the uncertainty you're saying. And I think this is why AI is so powerful, and it's a great opportunity, because anyone who understands modern technology, if they give you a 5-year plan, they are not going to be a successful CEO. You can say that with guarantee, because you have no idea. TV, if you look, it took 75 years to get to 100 million users. Netflix takes 10 years, and ChatGPT takes 2 months, and Facebook Threads takes 5 days. These are revolutionary things that end up disrupting everything. And if you had a 5-year plan last year and you said, I'm sticking to it and I'm using all my might to get to that end, that is an example of a bad CEO. That company is going down. And so no one now, we live in such an era of rapid change, that CEOs have to be agile, right? Leaders have to be adaptive. And so what does it mean to lead an ecosystem in times where you actually cannot see the future? Because we cannot see, it's not just a theoretical or a spiritual idea. You're really at a technological, real level. You have no idea what new innovation is just going to spring up on you and going to change everything. And AI is creating these radical innovations almost by the week. And so you have to really be, I think it changes the kind of leader that you need in times like this. So to me, it's a great opportunity to innovate organizations and leadership,
And I would respond to your questions, or to your critique, which is fine, very, very helpful, is to beauty or beautiful organizations. because, as you said, because people, they make mistakes. And exactly that is the reason what beautiful is about. Beautiful is about people making mistakes, learning from them, and then getting to another level. Because as you said, CEOs or whoever runs something like a company or an organization, makes plans, falls short of life. Because life is happening while you're making plans, as John Lennon already said, by the way. But you will fall short because, as you say, we have no idea what is around the corner, even next week. And so you need to make mistakes. And this is what beauty is about, because beauty has the darkness, the light, everything in it. That's beautiful. Otherwise, it would not be beautiful.
Mm-hmm. You with Train Consulting, you have 6 criteria for beautiful organizations. We've been talking about that in the past season of the podcast. How would you, Nipun, describe a beautiful organization? What criteria must a beautiful organization have? And can you actually relate to this term?
I like the term. There was a Tibetan monk, he asked a very interesting question one time. He says, what is aesthetic thought? So even before you get to organizations, you need people in the organizations. If you nuance it further, all people are having many thoughts. And what is the architecture of an aesthetic thought? And so I think there's a through line that you can draw from an aesthetic thought, which to me is a thought of compassion and connection, to relationships that are in the field of this regenerative beauty, to then systems that amplify this kind of possibility. Now, to me, if you were to say, well, what is one core characteristic of a beautiful organization? I would say it's an organization that is rooted in emergence. So even this notion of failure, you can only have failure if you had a predetermined idea of what the destination was. And so a beautiful organization is an organization that says we are not the sum total of our products and our output, we are actually the sum total of our relationships and what is happening in the space in between us. Because if you take care of the relationships, then naturally there's going to be all kinds of emergent output and emergent impact in the world. So how do we learn, or what innovations does it take? How do we marry the narrow margin propensity of technologies with the broad margin propensities of the heart?
You say relationships is one of the key values you would see in a company. And now I say again, kind of critical, what I experienced with a lot of modern companies when they talk about new work and stuff like that, and a lot of IT companies, they pretend to be like a family. You know, they do a lot for relationships, and they go on retreats, and they do family things where all the families are invited and stuff like that. But then on the other hand, the next day they get numbers from I don't know where, and they just fire a bunch of people. And that for me is like a contradiction, because if I am in a relationship, I cannot handle people as numbers. How can we deal with this? You know, like on the one hand, talking about relationships, but then on the other hand, seeing there is actually no relationship. It's just fake.
Yeah.
You understand what I'm saying?
Absolutely. And I wouldn't say it's fake, but I would say that there's 2 ways to look at some of this stuff, all the interventions that a company does. One is strategic intervention. The other is a principled intervention. So strategic intervention is, I'm stressing out all my employees, and could you come in and please lead a mindfulness meditation class for them? So why? As a pacifier for the status quo. So I can continue to be greedy and extractive, and all the stress is now pacified through all of this work. And that's what you're saying, is that so many people will have these retreats, and let's be relational, we'll give you time to volunteer, and let's bring your family in, and we have this purpose, and they lead with that purpose. But underneath it, there's a distinction between a strategic kind of intervention, which is done for the sake of extraction, versus principled sort of value-based, right? Like principled practice of generosity, for instance. What does it actually mean to be the kind of leader where somebody knocks on your door and you're going to make time? There are leaders like that, very famous people even, who have 0 time, and they will say, anyone who knocks on my door, I'm willing to give them a 5-minute meeting. And that's a kind of practice that you do. And can you have a culture of that practice? And so I think there is a very big distinction between strategic interventions and principled field interventions. One nuance I would add to this is that I think, leadership is hard work. So it's not like, hey, I care for all employees, I want to keep them all happy, because you sometimes get into these zero-sum games where to keep one person happy, the other person's not happy, right? And it's very complex. And so I think the thing about leadership is that you're not choosing between right and wrong. That would be easy. You have to choose between right and right. So if you're choosing between right and right and you are evaluating these two positions, on what basis? What is your core algorithm? And underneath the algorithm, what are you optimized for? What are the values that you're optimized for? And usually leaders, if you go and ask them, what are the core values you stand for? They just haven't done that kind of work. And so when you are tested with all these different competing priorities, your center of gravity ends up being very wobbly. And this is where, before we can even innovate, or maybe as we innovate organizations into a greater beauty, I think we will need a population and leadership that is rooted in a kind of deeper clarity around what they value and why they value it and how they communicate that.
I can see this totally when it comes to startup companies and companies that are just built.
Yeah.
When you start from scratch, you can, find your own system within this system. But what is it with traditional companies? Because all companies function in the system we're in right now, and that's a capitalistic, neoliberal system. And if things have been the way they've been for many, many years, how do you get leaders and entrepreneurs to this new way of thinking, to understanding it's not just all about financial capital, it's more about relationships and everything we've just been talking about? How do you get them to this new mindset?
I would like to start because, first of all, I would like to make a disclaimer for all leaders and managers listening to that. Leadership and management is hard work. Is a very, very complex, difficult job. So everyone who does that gets all my credit. The other thing is, I'm curious what you will be saying in a minute, Nipun, is that nowadays it gets a little bit easier for us coming from the outside who are there to break patterns and change because they ask us for. It's easier because the pain outside is so big. Labor shortage, climate crisis, democratic crisis, however you would call it. So the crises around them have become so evident that it's easier nowadays, as you see that nearly 80% of the workforce is not engaged. So it's easier nowadays to get to that point because the sense of urgency is much higher. That's the first I would like to say, and I'm curious how you do that, and can relate to that later.
So, let's say you have an ecosystem of givers, takers, and matchers in an ecosystem where givers give, takers are going to take, and matchers are going to be somewhere in between. That if you're a nice guy in the company, I'll be nice to you. If you're a taker, I'm going to put a boundary. And you're a conscious leader, you come into this equation and you say, I want to move the center of gravity towards more givers. Because there's no utopia anywhere, right? You don't go in and you say, wow, I have all givers here. Even at a startup, you're going to have the same issue. Even at a giant, Fortune 500 company, you're going to have the same issue. So you go in and you say, well, how do I move the center of gravity? And that's a fair, reasonable leadership question.
Can I just quickly ask something? The leaders, the givers, and the matchers, is that like a natural thing, like a personality type? Or is that how we are socialized? Or why would you find so many all the different types? Can't we make people to be just givers? Naively asked.
Yeah, it would be great. Maybe we can start with you and I. I'm not a giver all the time, but we want to be. We aspire to be. But we have, and I would say. So I actually talked with Adam, and we were saying that he says there are three kinds of people: givers, takers, and matchers. I refine that a little bit, and I would say there's three kinds of mindsets. That, even if I'm a taker at my company, and I'm like, I want to make sure I get like the most amount of money or most amount of credit, whatever, I go home, and if I have my kids or my loved ones, I'm not thinking like I'm going to be a taker, right? I'm a giver at home. And so in so many ways, I think we have, and really even one person is never a taker at work. They just have different mindsets that come up. But to the earlier point, well, how do we change the center of gravity? And it turns out that research on this is quite compelling and quite simple. If you just have one consistent contributor, that comes into an ecosystem where you have everyone, right? Givers, you have a whole spectrum of givers, takers, and matchers. If you just have one consistent contributor, it changes the center of gravity because it says to matchers that this is a place where I bring my giver self. This is a place where others are generous. This is a place where we're not playing a zero-sum game. So if I was a leader of a group, say any group, and I had a spectrum, the design question I would hold is how do I seed consistent contributors in this ecology? And then the follow-up question to that I would have is like, well, how do I not just seed, how do I amplify it? That's just a different design question than you would have typically. You would say, well, how do I get the maximum amount of output so that I can reach there? That's maybe a short margin, narrow margin goal, but I think the broad margin in the longer margin, this is going to be much more sustainable, emergent, and regenerative.
So sometimes we just ask the wrong questions, maybe.
I would say all the time.
Yes, that's one of the key concepts, to ask the right questions.
We could go on forever and never, I think, now, but we really have to come to an end, and I hope I have one good last question, as we were talking about questions.
Sure,
it's the one I always ask every guest, and it's the question about value. So I ask every guest we have here what's their value, like their core value in life and work would be, and they should leave this with us.
You know, the Buddha at one point was in an assembly, and somebody said, well, there's all these virtues, you know. Which virtue should we focus on? And there's all these core values, you know, which one should be a priority? And he gave a very interesting response. He says, compassion is like the footprint of an elephant. It's so big that it contains all these other virtues inside of it. So when an elephant walks, it's like a giant footprint, you know, and inside that footprint, so much life resides. And so for me, I think it is also, I'll copy paste from the Buddha. and I will say compassion.
Nice one.
What can you say after Buddha, right? Nothing can come.
Now, Lothar Wenzl.
Yes, thank you. No, I would say, again, I'd go back to trust in the process of life. I would say that. Trust. It helps me most.
Yeah, I like trust. I'll copy paste Lothar next time.
Thank you very much, Nipun, for all those insights. It was really interesting.
Very inspiring talking to you both.
Thank you.
Having you on our podcast.
Likewise, and I'm so glad it wasn't our AI talking to each other.
Are you sure?
I just wanted to say, liebe listener, you can now find out. Was it an AI? Was it really Nipun Mehta? Was it Mari Lang and Lothar Wenzl? We don't know. That's all for this episode. Please let us know what you think of the show. You can drop us a line and we'll find our contacts in the show notes. We'll be back soon. See ya. Das war Die Schöne
und das Biest.
Ein Podcast von
Mari Lang
und Train Consulting Geschäftsführer Lothar Wenzl.